Air bearing. Air bearing. Angular contract bearing. Angular contract bearing. Ball bearing. Ball bearing. Clutch release bearing. Clutch release bearing. Conveyor bearing. Conveyor bearing. Cylindrical roller bearing. Cylindrical roller bearing. Deep groove bearing. Deep groove bearing. Double ball bearing. Double ball bearing. Eccentric bearing. Eccentric bearing. Flange bearing. Flange bearing. Fluid bearing. Fluid bearing. Hydrodynamic bearing. Hydrodynamic bearing. Journal bearing. Journal bearing. Linear bearing. Linear bearing. Magnetic bearing. Magnetic bearing. Needle roller bearing. Needle roller bearing. Pillow block bearing. Pillow block bearing. Plane bearing. Plane bearing. Radial bearing. Radial bearing. Rod end bearing. Rod end bearing. Roller bearing. Roller bearing. Self-aligning bearing. Self-aligning bearing. Sleeve bearing. Sleeve bearing. Slew bearing. Slew bearing. Spherical bearing. Spherical bearing. Split bearing. Split bearing. Tapered roller bearing. Tapered roller bearing. Thrust bearing. Thrust bearing. Turntable bearing. Turntable bearing.